pleased to introduce Dr. Marissa Thompson, who is an assistant professor of sociology at Columbia University, where she joined the faculty in 2022. Prior to her current appointment, she earned her PhD in sociology at Stanford in 2021 and completed a postdoctoral fellowship in forestry public policy at the University of Penn. I also have to mention that she's a Penn alumna, having graduated magna cum laude with a bachelor's degree in chemical and biomolecular engineering in 2016. Her research focuses on the causes and consequences of racial and socioeconomic inequality, with a particular focus on the role of education in shaping disparate outcomes over the life course. Marissa's current research investigates, for example, parental preferences regarding school segregation, the causal effects of first-dollar scholarship policies on college access, and the role of genetic ancestry tests in racial boundary-making processes, which we'll hear about today. She employs a range of quantitative and computational methods using large national data sets, administrative data, and novel survey experiments. Her recent publications have appeared in Social Forces, Sociology of Education, Socius, and Science. And we're delighted to welcome Marissa here today to share her current research. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for having me here today and for that very kind introduction. Again, my name is Marissa Thompson, and I'm here to present a paper entitled "They Have Black in Their Blood." I should say that's a quote from one of our respondents, not a position of the research team, exploring how genetic ancestry tests affect racial appraisals and classifications. But before I get into it, as Paul mentioned, I'm a graduate of Penn, and so it's very exciting to be back on campus today. I had a nice walk down Locust Walk this morning, and I'm excited to be back in part because some of my research has been inspired by some moments here on campus. So if you'll forgive a quick detour down Locust Walk to Perelman Quad, I've been, one moment in particular inspired some of my recent research. So this is a picture from my graduation ceremony, specifically the Black graduation ceremony in Perelman Quad. And this moment ended up inspiring a paper of mine. I don't know if you've already sort of noticed, but while we were taking this picture, I was struck by the really stark gender differences here. This is, not everyone, but many of the members of my class, and only this front row here is made up of Black boys and men relative to all of these rows of Black women. And so, of course, this is a snapshot from one institution, but it is broadly representative of national trends and educational attainment disparities by gender. And while we were taking this picture, for me, this was mostly just an unfortunate social situation. But when I got to graduate school and I was thinking about what I wanted to study for my dissertation, this ended up being a moment that came back to me, and eventually was a study for my dissertation, which was just published in Social Forces a few months ago. So, formative moments had here at Penn, just down the road. And if you're curious, that's me, the very, very macro. Okay, so getting back to the task at hand, I want to also introduce my co-authors for this study, Sam Trejo, who's at Princeton, AJ Albero, who is at Florida, and Daphne Marchenko, who is at Stanford. This has been a really wonderful team to work with. We started this project a number of years ago when we were all graduate students and postdocs, and so it's been exciting to see it move along to the point where it is now, where we're all faculty at our respective institutions. So this is a talk about genetic ancestry tests, as you may have guessed. And to set the scene, genetic ancestry tests have really exploded in recent years. So as of 2013, very, very few people had taken a direct-to-consumer genetic ancestry test. This figure is a bit outdated, but as recently as 2022, some 60 million Americans had taken direct-to-consumer genetic ancestry tests from companies such as 23andMe.com, Ancestry.com or 23andMe, to trace the approximate regions from that their ancestors may have originated in. And these tests are, in a sense, remaking the ways that some people think about racial roots. So, sort of ripped straight from the headlines, The Atlantic ran an article a few years ago about a man named Ralph Taylor who had always identified as white and then took a genetic ancestry test and found a small amount of sub-Saharan African ancestry. So after he took this test, he subsequently went forward and began identifying as Black and ended up suing the government in order to take part in a funding program for Black-owned businesses. He said that the test proved that he was Black, proved in quote marks here, and sort of shows the way in which genetic ancestry tests are, for some people, refashioning the ways that they're thinking about race. Likewise, right here in Philadelphia, a woman named Raquel Saraswati recently came under fire. She had long been maintaining that she was a woman of color, but faced allegations that maybe she was misleading people about her background. And like Ralph, offered up a genetic ancestry test as proof of her racial origins. And Wendy's actually quoted in this article here, but again, showing the ways that both that individuals are sometimes offering up genetic ancestry tests to prove something about their race, but also that this idea that race has to be embedded within this broader social process. Not everyone who identifies a certain way is likely to be socially accepted as a member of that group. And social controversy over who is and who is not a member of a specific racial group is an age-old feature of the US racial landscape. For as long as we've been categorizing people, there has been controversy over who should fall into certain racial groups. And race and ancestry have this particularly fraught relationship here. They're often conflated both by the public, but even in sometimes in the academy, we find that people are holding genetic essentialist views and sort of believing that there is this strong biological relationship between race and ancestry, when in fact, as we know as social scientists, race is a social construct. It's made up of a number of social features about a person, including their skin color and their region of ancestry, but also other features about them. In contrast, genetic ancestry tests, which is sort of the predominant avenue through which people are, at least consumers, are interacting with the underlying ancestry data, provide approximate estimates of which sections of your genome can be mapped to various populations. So somebody taking a genetic ancestry test might get something like this. This is an ad from 23andMe, where the sections of their genome might be broken down to different populations that align with different continental populations, but not necessarily lining up with our social conceptions of racial group membership. And then also consumers receive very little information about how to interpret their GAP results, which, as you can imagine, leads to confusion at times about what these tests are actually showing. And so this is a study that's particularly focused on Black Americans. We're interested in understanding how Black Americans construct racial boundaries, particularly when it comes to the question of who should or should not be sort of socially accepted into the broader group of Black Americans. And we're focusing on Black Americans for two main reasons. The first is drawing from Du Bois here, thinking about the problem of the color line. So a long US history of formalizing white and Black distinctions, and one that is marking profound inequality facing the broader Black community. So inequality in wealth and in income and education and home ownership. And so for that reason, we're particularly interested in the Black community specifically. Also drawing from Frederick Douglass, we're interested in the Black community because for Black Americans, the majority of whom are, at least in the US, are descended from enslaved populations, it's difficult, if not impossible, to trace ancestral origins through sort of standard genealogical services because those records have been lost or destroyed by history. I know this from my own family's personal experiences trying to trace our family origins back. It just becomes impossible after a certain point. And so for that reason, among others, there's this sort of unique interest among members of the Black community in genetic ancestry testing. And so we were interested, that's the second reason that we were interested in focusing specifically on US-born Black Americans in this study. So getting to the research questions, we're interested in the effect of ancestry as measured by a genetic ancestry test on classification and appraisal outcomes by an observer. And so by classification, I specifically mean how somebody racially classifies another person. So you have a person's self-identification, but then you also have how other people are classifying that person, embedding an individual decision to identify a certain way in a broader social process of racial classifications and racial norms. We're also interested in racial appraisals, and here we're thinking about appraisal outcomes as the how somebody feels about or evaluates another person's identification decision. So the qualitative process through which a classification decision is made. We're interested in if the effect of ancestry varies across prior identification and setting, and I'll get into that in a minute. and as well as if it's mediated by perceptions of integrity, discrimination, and shared culture. So to find out, we ran a pre-registered survey experiment with 3,100 US-born Black Americans who each read a vignette about a fictitious individual with a number of different randomly assigned characteristics. We experimentally varied 3 aspects of this person's background, this fictitious person again. So first, their sub-Saharan African ancestry percentage as measured by a genetic ancestry test. There, we randomly assigned respondents to either read that about someone with 4 or 36% sub-Saharan African ancestry. And those numbers are drawn from pre-tests with, I'll show you the images in a minute, but they're drawn from pre-tests with other US-born Black Americans in terms of levels of plausible in their minds, sub-Saharan African ancestry among the images that we used. We varied their prior identification. So they had either in the past been identifying as Black or not as Black. We kept it vague what else they might have been identifying as. And then the setting in which they're identifying as Black. So either on a government census or on a scholarship intended for Black students to get a sense of threat over scarce resources or perceived scarce resources, and if people classify people differently under those conditions. We use 12 names and 6 images that are all randomly assigned. The names and images that we use are all very similar in their white to Black ambiguity. We're using them here essentially as a control measure. We want to make sure that our treatment effects are valid over a range of similar names and appearances, that they're not specifics to the nuances of the image that we may have chosen. And the names come from New York State birth registry data. We use names that have similar likelihoods of being assigned to a white versus a Black newborn. And then we use 6 randomly assigned images from the Chicago Faces database. Again, all similar in terms of their white to Black ambiguity. That's based both on the norming data that comes with the Chicago Faces database, but then also from pretest. And so these are the 6 images that we used, again, randomly assigned to respondents. We also asked 2 free response questions. I'm going to get into this though toward the end of the presentation. So we'll start with some of the other outcomes first. So respondents began the study and read about Ava or Daniel or one of the 12 assigned names, and they received an image that went along with the vignette. So they might read, meet Ava. Ava is an American citizen whose family has been in the US for generations. Ava is usually unsure of how to identify, but mostly either has or has not identified as Black or African American. I mentioned this earlier also, we focused only on US-born Black Americans in order to ensure, because conceptions of race vary, of course, across different places. We wanted to make sure that they were at least, they were born in the US and were more likely to hold these sort of US notions of what racial membership mean. And then they would see one of the 6 images. So here, this is Ava, but while we were constructing the study, we had a number of different names that we used for the different figures. And this one was Zendaya because we all thought that she looks a little bit like Zendaya, although that, of course, was not one of the names that we used in the study. So Ava recently received her genetic ancestry tests. We gave them a little bit of information about what a genetic ancestry test showed, and then estimated her test showed that she had either 4 or 36% sub-Saharan African ancestry and the balance non-African ancestry. And then a few weeks after receiving her genetic ancestry test results, she either filled out the government census and identified as Black, or she applied for a college scholarship intended for Black students. And after respondents read this vignette, we asked them a number of key outcomes. First, how positive or negative they felt about Ava's decision to identify as Black, giving us a sense of that appraisal outcome. And then, in their opinion, how they would classify Ava. And again, Ava or Daniel or whatever name, but I think it's more straightforward to use the same name in the presentation. And here we use the OMB categories, but put race and ethnicity together. And then in their opinion, how do they think most other US-born Black Americans would classify Ava? So not just how a respondent themselves might classify her, but how they think everybody else in the broader Black community is likely to classify her. Okay, so I think questions are at the end, so I'm just going to keep going, but I'm going to get into some of the results for the earlier outcomes and before getting into the text data. Okay, so I'm going to set this figure up slowly. Maybe I'll use this one over here. So this is going to show the treatment effects of high relative to low sub-Saharan African ancestry, so 36 relative to 4%, across each of the four pairwise comparisons of the non-ancestry treatment conditions. So a version of AVA who in the past has been identifying as Black, so in this sense, just continuing to identify as Black and is doing so now on a census, has previously been identifying as Black and is now doing it on a scholarship, has previously not been identifying as Black, and so on and so forth. We pre-registered it this way because we thought that there was going to be an interaction here. We thought we'd find heterogeneous effects of ancestry across these different conditions. We didn't actually end up finding that, but put the treatment estimates up. These four coefficients are not statistically distinct, so I'm going to focus us on the pooled coefficient over to the side. But we find that there's a 0.22 standard deviation increase in that Likert scale measured of approval. That's a 7-point Likert scale. For the high ancestry condition relative to the low ancestry condition. So more approval generally of AVA's decision. And so same figure here, except we're measuring respondents' likelihood of classifying AVA as Black relative to not classifying her and choosing a different racial or ethnic subgroup. And here, again, not statistically distinct between the blue coefficients, so I'll focus on the red pool coefficient. We find an 11 percentage point increase in the likelihood of classifying AVA as Black for the high relative to low ancestry condition. And similarly, again, a 9 percentage point increase when we're looking at the outcome of how respondents perceive everyone else in the broader Black community to classify AVA. So in the higher ancestry condition, we see more higher levels of that Likert measured approval, but also higher likelihoods of respondents themselves classifying AVA as Black and believing that the broader Black community would as well. Interestingly, though, we don't find a lot of disapproval and negative opinions of AVA. So this is just a histogram of the Likert, the 7-point Likert responses, all for the low sub-Saharan African ancestry condition. So all among people who read about 4% sub-Saharan African ancestry on AVA's genetic ancestry test. And we were expecting to see, more sort of negative views of AVA, but what we're finding is that the bulk of responses are either in this sort of neutral, equally positive and negative, or actually in an extremely positive response. So not a lot of negativity or gatekeeping around AVA's decision here, or ability to, she's a fictitious person, but in a sense, her ability to identify as Black. And then when we add in the high sub-Saharan African ancestry condition, again, the 36% in the red here, we see, more extreme positive views and fewer of these negative views, but in general, we're not seeing that there's, radically different amounts of approval depending on those two ancestry conditions, which suggests that, and I'll show this again as well in the next slide, this sense of, you can think of it like an inclusive form of hypodescent, where a version of AVA with a lower level of sub-Saharan African ancestry is still sort of welcomed or approved of, or at the very worst sort of neutral, but not facing a lot of disapproval. Okay, so then looking at the classification decisions, we found a couple of interesting patterns. So here is the fraction classifying AVA as Black. We're comparing respondents themselves in the green bars compared to their perceptions of the broader Black community in the blue bars. And as we move from what we're calling the theoretical low, so that's the low ancestry condition with AVA identifying as Black on a scholarship and has not previously been identifying as Black. Theoretically, that's the lowest likelihood version of AVA that's going to be classified as Black, and then moving all the way up to the theoretical high ancestry, identifying as Black on a census and is continuing to identify as Black. We find a couple interesting patterns. So first, over 50% of people in the theoretical low condition are still classifying AVA as Black. So again, we're not seeing, a low likelihood there of classifying AVA as Black, and as I showed you in the previous slide, a lot of disapproval. Generally, we're seeing, though, as it goes across the board, we're seeing it gets higher as expected based also on the average treatment effect, but still a lot of respondents in the theoretical low are still classifying her as Black and believe that most other Black Americans would too, although there we dip below 50%. The other pattern I want to call your attention to here is this gap at all of the different in all of the different treatment conditions between how an individual themselves would classify AVA relative to everybody else in the broader Black community. So And that's persistent across the levels. And that's not something that we were necessarily expecting to find. And because the sample is nationally representative, you would expect them, if people were correct about their perceptions of everyone else, you would expect these to align a little bit more. But we're seeing that individuals view themselves as, in a sense, maybe more permissive, more likely to classify Ava this way than they think everybody else in the community would. Finally, at least for the main effects, I want to get into the main effects of setting and prior identification. So in the blue here, we have the treatment effects of the census condition relative to the scholarship condition for the Likert measured approval. Here is in standard deviation units, and then respondents classification in percentage points, and average Black American classification in percentage points. So different units here, but all on the same figure, just to give you an overview of those main effects of setting. And what we find is that respondents reading about a version of Ava who is identifying as Black on the census are, report a higher level of approval. So 0.1 standard deviation higher on that Likert scale, standardized Likert scale, but are no differently likely to classify Ava as Black. Which is interesting because it means that whether or not somebody approves of someone else's identification decision is not necessarily a function of whether they themselves would classify that person as Black, or at least it's not being affected by ancestry in the same way that the appraisal outcome is. And I'll get to this more in the text responses, but it sort of shows that there's these two things happening here that aren't necessarily linked. Whether you approve of someone's broader decision to identify, but then also the classification decision happening somewhat separately. And then for prior identification, we find that a version reading about Ava when she has previously identified as Black has a causal effect on approval as well as classification and perceptions of classification by the broader Black community, which was what we expected as well. And so while coming up with the study and working through what we thought would be at play here, what we thought the potential mechanisms might be, we included three ideas about what might be leading to differences in these responses. So the first is perceptions of shared culture. This is perceptions of whether or not Ava shares heritage and experiences and broader culture with the Black community. We were interested in people's perceptions of whether they believed Ava had faced discrimination on the basis of her race over her lifetime. We thought maybe that would explain some of this ancestry effect. And then we also investigated what we're calling an integrity index. So that's the first principal component of three underlying questions on the fairness, honesty, and legitimacy, perceived, of course, of Ava's decision to identify as Black. And so here I'm just going to show the fraction of the ancestry effect that's mediated by each of these three questions using sort of standard mediation analysis, the extent to which the coefficient of ancestry is changing based on the inclusion of these underlying measures. So what we find is that over 60% of the Likert approval effect of ancestry is mediated by what we're calling an integrity index. So people's perceptions of the fairness and the honesty and the legitimacy of Ava's decision. And then a little less than 20% of that is mediated by perceptions of Ava's shared culture with the broader Black community. So a sense of, whether Ava might be invited to the cookout. We didn't find, and this really surprised me, I thought that discrimination was going to be have more teeth here, but perceived discrimination mediates essentially none of the overall effect that we're finding. And that's true when it comes to the classification outcomes as well. So there we find a broadly similar pattern with a large fraction of that effect mediated by perceptions of integrity, and then a decent portion as well mediated by perceptions of shared culture. So this suggests that people believe that there's an underlying fair, honest, and legitimate way to identify that is in part at least stemming from people's from a genetic ancestry test. So tying integrity or ideas about integrity back to racial classifications. We were interested in a couple other features about the individuals to see if it moderated any of the effects. Just spoiler alert, none of these ended up affecting our treatment effects, but we captured them nonetheless. About 14% of our sample had taken a genetic ancestry test. We obviously thought that people who had taken tests may interact with our vignette treatment differently. but didn't explain the effect that we were seeing. We were also interested in people's perceptions of both their own sub-Saharan African ancestry percentage. Again, these are all self-identified Black Americans, as well as their perceptions of how much sub-Saharan African ancestry the average Black American might hold. In case that they had, we wanted to know if people thought 4% was a lot or a little, and this could give us a sense of that. But none of these results ended up moderating the effect that we found. And I'm happy to show a table and a couple figures on these distributions in the appendix if anyone's interested in seeing them. Okay, so earlier I mentioned that we also collected text data. We had 2 free response questions that we included as a part of this study to get at how people are reacting in the moment to reading about AVA's classification decision. And the reason we included this is because while the survey measures can capture a lot about how people are responding, so their approval and their classification, reactions are also, when you react to something in the real world, it's happening in a longer form. There's a lot more nuance that's missed by only including those questions. And so we asked 2 free response questions of each of our respondents. First, about their broad and general beliefs about what it means for a person to be Black, the characteristics, the experiences, the attitudes, and the values that define being Black or African American, and then specifically how they feel about AVA, identifying as Black in the given treatment setting condition. And here we asked them to specify their reactions, thoughts, and emotions about her decision. And we were actually really pleased with how much people wrote here. We weren't sure, with a survey, you're never sure how thoughtful and careful people are going to be when they're going through your study, but we ended up with a lot of really informative text data, about 2 paragraphs per respondent. So, 6,200 text documents to work through in terms of trying to understand how people are responding to AVA in this experiment. And to analyze it, we use structural topic modeling. Structural topic modeling is a machine learning-based analysis of open-ended text responses. And we're able to model word co-occurrences in those documents, looking for underlying latent themes, so which we're calling topics. So it's able to, out of those 6,200 documents, pull out themes and patterns that tend to occur and reoccur between people who are writing about AVA, and then we're able to also, because this is an experiment and we've randomly assigned treatment conditions, we can see how any of our experimental treatments affect the kinds of things that people are writing about when they're responding to our study. And then, as I mentioned before, we're able to index some of the nuance that might be missed by other survey questions. So not just whether people approve or have sort of extremely positive or extremely negative views of AVA, but why, and how are they, what kind of language are they using to either approve of AVA or reject her. And so in order to do this, we use the 50-50 testing and training data set split the data, put the testing data aside, and didn't use it until we had finished with the training data to avoid overfitting it with the topics that were generated from the STM. And so with that training data set, we ran a structural topic model using both of those documents, both the define being Black question and the reaction to decision question to define the underlying topics. We used the LDA tuning library in R to generate an appropriate number of topics for our document corpus, which was about 45 topics. And then we went through and manually coded them. So the structural topic model just gives us the documents themselves and a topic score, as well as words that are frequent and exclusive to each topic, but it doesn't name them. So we have to go in and, we have these topics and these documents and then try to understand what the respondents are getting at here. And so what we did was, because there's 4 of us on this team, to get a sense of inter-rater reliability, we split up and each of the 4 of us went through and coded all of the topics ourselves manually, and then came together and sort of fought and agreed and disagreed until we ended up with names that describe each of those 45 topics. Given our sample size, though, we focused on 7 for confirmatory analysis, but I'm happy to talk about the exploratory analysis in the appendix. And so then, once we had defined these topics and added an addendum to our pre-registry with the mapping functions to get those topics, and of course the confirmatory topics themselves, then and only then did we access the testing data to project the topics onto the reaction to decision question. That's that second response. And finally, analyzing the causal effect of treatment assignment on the topics that come up in the document. So we're able to see if reading about the high ancestry condition versus low ancestry condition leads to any sort of differences in the qualitative ways that people are describing their reactions to Ava in that moment. But first I want to give you a sense, I'll just put them all up at once, give you a sense of the 7 topics that we're looking at for confirmatory analysis. So here I've listed them all, but I'll go through them in more detail, along with the words that are frequent and exclusive to each of the topics. So for example, the topic on historical adversity had a lot of words like fight and struggle and slavery and fear as words that were frequent and exclusive to the category or the topic of historical adversity. And to give you an idea of what these documents look like, what people were writing about, for example, in a document that was primarily classified under the historical adversity topic by the structural topic model, one respondent wrote that the African American experience is years of slavery, oppression, calculated methods set in place by slave masters to keep Black people oppressed during and after slavery and even to this day. So this topic really focused on the long legacy of inequality in the Black community and the ways in which that either defined Blackness for that respondent or the ways in which they were reacting to Ava. Likewise, another topic that still focused on the legacy of adversity and inequality, but reframed it a bit in terms of pride and resilience was the pride and resilience topic. So this person wrote about being Black as a privilege and an honor. I'm so proud of how my ancestors paved the way for a better today and more equality tomorrow. We have a Black future. So heard it here first, a very bright future for the Black community. And this is of course where the topic from our paper comes from. People were tying ideas about blood and one-drop rules to genetic ancestry tests and race. So in a document that was classified under the one-drop rule topic, this person wrote a person being Black is a person that has Black traits in their blood. They have Black in their blood. And there was a number of documents like this that were tying ideas about blood to ideas about race. And of course, not using this language, but giving us a sense of the extent to which they were thinking of race as an essentialist trait, something that could be found within, inscribed within someone's genes. And then finally, another topic specifically on genetic ancestry, one that focused not just on the test itself, but also threshold. So talking about different percentages and so on. Okay, so we projected those topics, those 7 confirmatory topics onto the second free response question. And we can analyze the effect of each of the treatment conditions on prevalence of all of these topics. Okay, so this is flipped from the way I showed it to you before. It's now a vertical coefficient column that shows the treatment effect of high relative to low ancestry on all 7 of the topics, the confirmatory topics. And we find actually that there's no difference, no statistically distinct differences between how people are writing about Ava if they're in the high versus the low ancestry condition. When we bring in the main effects of setting and prior identification, though, I'll highlight the statistically significant findings. We do actually find that the ways that people are writing about and describing their reactions to Ava do seem to be a function of the setting in which Ava is identifying as Black and whether or not she's identified as Black in the past. So, for example, for those who are assigned to the scholarship condition, we find that they're more likely to write about historical adversity and much less likely to write about race as a personal choice, much less likely to write about genetic ancestry tests. So you can sort of think about it as in what could be viewed as a lower stake setting, like a census. When asked about Ava's decision, they are, writing about race as a personal choice, but as soon as it becomes a scholarship, maybe a higher stakes decision, all of a sudden that language goes away. No longer are they talking about race as something that's, it's up to you to decide, it's up to Ava to choose what she wants to be. And likewise, we also find statistically significant effects of prior identification. So racial fluidity, a sense of racial boundary crossing potentially on the topics that people are writing about. So in those who are assigned to read about Ava, who has previously been identifying as Black, so in a sense, continuing to identify as Black, they are more likely to write about the physical features that they use to define Blackness, writing about skin and hair and whatnot, and also more likely to write about the one-drop rule, but much less likely I'm sorry, that's much less likely to show up when Ava is switching from mostly not having identified as Black in the past, but now is. So across the board, we're seeing, while ancestry doesn't affect how people are, the qualitative ways that people are describing Ava and her decision, we do find that setting and prior identification does, which particularly in the case of setting is interesting because as you may remember, setting doesn't affect how they classify her. So it's affecting the ways that they're writing about her, whether they approve of her, but not any, we don't see any differences in how, in whether they would classify her as Black themselves or think that everybody else in the broader Black community would. Okay, I have no idea how long I've been talking. Oh, I'm still good, okay. So in conclusion, we find that genetic ancestry tests meaningfully affect in-group conceptions of race. We do find a wide range of beliefs about an individual's decision to identify as Black that on average seems to be consistent with this idea of inclusive hypodescent. But we do find a lot of differences. And then as I showed you in the text responses, at least some respondents are responding in ways that make us think that they are thinking of race as this essentialist trait, as something that can be found on a genetic ancestry test, or something related to blood, as I showed you in the text responses. So a lot of information here about the ways that people are thinking about and using genetic ancestry tests in everyday settings. We also find that the treatment effects of ancestry on classification and appraisal outcomes operate largely through perceived integrity. That's the fairness, the honesty, and the legitimacy of the respondent's decision. But also respondents perceive culture as mattering for the classifications, particularly those made by other Black Americans, by the broader Black community. We find, again, those green and blue bars that Black Americans see themselves as more permissive on average than the broader Black community, that they see themselves as at least having a different classification logic or norm than everybody else. And so this study, I should have mentioned this at the beginning, but our goal with this study is sort of applying empirical evidence to a broader social constructivist theory of race. So understanding the extent to which everyday Americans are thinking about race as something that's socially constructed, how it varies across ancestry levels and settings, or the extent to which maybe they are holding essentialist views and trying to sort of map that out in understanding the contours of how people define Blackness, and are either rejecting or approving of Ava's decision. And then finally, and we get into this more in the paper, our theoretical contribution for the study is the features that affect those appraisals differ from those that are affecting classification. So the features about Ava, her ancestry, the setting, and the prior identification, the features that affect whether people approve and then qualitatively how they're writing about this seem to differ and operate in some sense independently from their classification outcomes. And so I can show a quick model of how we're thinking about this. This is a simple model that looks at the friction between an observer's racial classification and an individual's racial identification, and how that friction is likely what leads to approval or disapproval. So only if, and we're holding Ava's racial identification fixed here, which is why it's grayed out, but only if I identify Ava as something that's not Black, but she identifies herself as Black, and we have that friction there, you would imagine that that's what's leading to, okay, now I disapprove or I approve of Ava's decision. And so any features about Ava that are affecting her appraisal should be operating through classification. But what we find here is that there's this other pathway where there are features about Ava, in particular the setting, and we're going to get into that hopefully in our next paper, is we find that the setting is impacting appraisal, but in a pathway that's not operating through classification. So more about that in the paper, but something unexpected that we found with this study. And so in terms of the next steps, we have a lot of data, particularly text data that some of it made it into this paper that I've talked about today, but a lot that we'd still like to keep looking at. And so in terms of the next 2 steps for this project, we're interested in thinking particularly about boundary crossing and racial fluidity in high versus lower stakes settings. So in that scholarship versus the census condition, and going through all of that data, the text data, and understanding how people decide when and how they react to Ava. And we're still in very early stages of this, but we're finding that when people assume a sense of transience on Ava's part, they are very disapproving of that, but when they perceive it as a more durable change in her, or a long-lasting change in her racial identification, even if it's a switch and it's in a high-stakes setting, that's when they're more welcoming and more happy about this decision. And then we're also doing a broader qualitative analysis of the defining being Black question, that first response question, because all of the causal effects that I've shown you here were on that second question. So much more to be done on the first question. Okay, that's all I have for today. Thank you so much, everyone. I wanted to quickly acknowledge funding from the Columbia Population Research Center for helping us run the study, and the working papers here if you'd like to read it. Thank you.
Can we usually take the first question from a graduate student in the audience? All right.
This was a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you included or plan to include questions of the respondents on kind of their experience of inclusivity into the community, because I imagine that might impact whether they believe this other person would have that same.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we didn't include a specific question on whether they felt like they had been welcomed, but there's a couple questions that could be a rough proxy for that. And so at first, people could write whatever they wanted in the define being Black condition, or sorry, in the define being Black response question. And so some people did say, well, I had this, and so I think this. And that gave us a sense of that, and we can go and look through that qualitatively. But also, we were also interested in people's perceptions of their own sub-Saharan African ancestry percentages. Because people, you can imagine for people for whom they think that they have a lower level of sub-Saharan African ancestry, they might, have one Black grandparent or one Black great-grandparent and not feel as included in the broader Black community. And so that was another question that can sort of get at that, although not exactly in the way that you're saying. But we didn't find, at least for that question, that varied according to, that didn't affect the overall treatment conditions that we're finding, but definitely something we can look into more in the text data. Thank you. I don't know if I get to call that. Yes.
I find some optimism in the work, don't you? I mean, it seems to me the respondents see race as a social construct.
I think I think for some of them, yes. I think the text responses are is where we see less of that, with the ways that they're writing about, blood and ancestry, but there is also a lot of really, positivity, and we do see that both in the quantitative outcomes and the likelihood of classifying Ava as Black, it being over 50% for the 4% sub-Saharan African ancestry condition, and in other text responses where people are quite welcoming. I mean, a lot of the respondents said, I'm really proud of Ava. She finally found her true roots, and anyone is welcome. And it was a much more inclusive version of, I guess it's not gatekeeping if it's inclusive. So it was an inclusive vision of racial group membership. So definitely variation, but I think, yes, on the whole, much less sort of disapproval and rejection than I was honestly expecting to see.
It seems to me I would expect a bigger treatment effect if people really thought that, the percentage of your sub-Saharan ancestry, you would think that effect would be much bigger.
That's true.
It's small.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
Thank you. Great presentation. You have data, you have lots of excellent data for many papers to come.
I hope so.
Thank you. I was curious, in your theoretical model, there was a box about the observers' characteristics, and I wonder if more characteristics would matter. For example, educational level of the respondent, and even age. If you think, that perhaps younger people would have different views of race, more interracial marriage, more different conceptualizations of race. So I wonder if you looked at those.
Yes, so I don't have a slide for it, but there was no difference, or no, at least it didn't, an interaction between age and the ancestry condition. We also looked, so we have respondents' age and education. I have a couple images here, so I can show you, gender heterogeneity, not, major differences by gender or, these are the different outcomes, by immigration. I mean, the wider confidence intervals because we don't have as many respondents whose only parents but not grandparents were born in the US. Most of our respondents are over here in the parents and grandparents born in the US category. And then some differences also by political party, but not as many because there just are fewer Black Republicans than there are Republicans in the broader population. So really wide confidence intervals there. So definitely we looked at differences, and that would be other things that affect in that theoretical model. We don't see that play out here very strongly, but certainly in follow-up studies could be something that we, investigate. That those were more of a, like, we included those as controls and for some heterogeneity analysis, but they weren't the meat of the study. And but I definitely think it could, particularly, I was surprised that age wasn't more of a factor. I mean, even just anecdotally, me and my parents have very different ideas about sort of racial boundaries, and so I would have expected to see it more strongly, but it's not at least not here among the responses we have. But thank you. Yes.
So it's really interesting that people have the disjuncture or slight difference between people's own views and what they imagine others' views to be. Do you interpret that as possibly a social desirability bias? So I don't want to admit that I would exclude this person, but I think, oh, my aunt might or something. And then I was also curious about the gender. Is that the gender of the observer or that's the gender of the image? Were there any image effects?
So let's see, image, not statistically, these are not statistically distinct from each other, but we did look for image effects, which are gender effects is like, I have to go back and look. I think these three, maybe it's here actually. Oh, yes. Okay. So A, C, and E, I should have put them in order now that I think about it, are sort of the male presenting, and then B, D, and F are female presenting, but we're not seeing major gender differences from the image. The gender effects I showed you before were from the respondents. So yes, I think it could be viewed as a sense of social desirability bias, or like a good person effect, where it's like everyone else is going to discriminate against her, but I'm not. I'm nice to Ava. I'm going to welcome her within the broader Black community. But I'm not totally sure.
I mean, the numbers are still high, but so.
Yeah, there is that gap, and that could be meaningful. If there is a Ava out there who is sort of on the margin or thinking about her own racial identification, but thinks that everyone else is going to, keep her out, that could also affect how people, how people are sort of thinking through their own racial identities in real time. This like distance between what you think everyone else is doing and what you're doing, and so could be meaningful in terms of like individual self-identification or how people respond, and something that we weren't expecting as a surprising finding. Yes.
So you already answered some of my questions, but could you talk a little bit more about your survey design and like recruitment of your respondents? Like how exactly did you access the population? How were you like kind of, I guess like, just a little bit.
No, that's a great question.
On that.
So we ran this with YouGov. So they did all of the recruiting for us. We paid YouGov, and then they find paid respondents, and then they provide us also with survey weights so that it can be, broadly nationally representative of the US born Black population. It did mean that we needed to make some tweaks to our initial survey design because a fair amount of this population they're taking YouGov surveys on their phone, whereas we had first designed it for just computers, for example. So there were some sort of like changes that we had to make early on, but YouGov handled most of the survey recruitment and all of that.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Yes.
And I thought your presentation was very good also, and so thank you for that. In terms of the way you present the individuals, 6 individuals, did you or have you considered adding variables such as religious background? Or perhaps something like how much North African ancestry you have on genomic test, which is reflective of more complexities within the African experience vis-a-vis the African diaspora, but also simply on the basis of genomic ancestry.
Yeah.
And the third question is, did you think about having your respondents be persons who also did genetic testing to see what the effect of their own ancestry exploration had on their perceptions of others they're being asked to comment on or to evaluate in the way you put forward in your experimental design?
Yeah, that's a great question. So We did consider, thinking about different sort of regions, African region in particular for the vignette. The reason that we just focused on sub-Saharan African ancestry and also provided an example, because in our pretest, there was some confusion about where exactly the boundaries of sub-Saharan Africa are, is partly a sample size restriction. So we wanted to do a vignette study instead of a conjoint experiment, but that meant that we were, much more limited in terms of our power. And so we had to make some tough calls, and with 4 of us on the paper, it was also some fights about what ultimately was the underlying key goal of the study. And so we did consider that and ultimately ended up not doing it in this version, but could be something that we do down the line. The reason we didn't restrict to genetic ancestry test experience was because we wanted, most of the Black population of the US has not taken the genetic ancestry test. So we wanted to know how the broad population would respond to a situation like this. We did think that we might see differences between the 14% of them who had taken a genetic ancestry, in our sample, 14% had taken a genetic ancestry test. We did think that we would see differences between them and everybody else, but that didn't end up coming out. Although we did have a sort of a distribution of how people responded in terms of their perceived own genetic ancestry test results and how they think the broader Black community would respond. A sample size restriction there as well. Was there another question? I think.
Other variables that might factor into the social description of race,
Oh, religion.
faith, for example.
Yes,
which has a big.
Yeah, so no, we did not include religion. Although I think there's other studies going on that also, this is a lot of folks are looking at racial classifications and we didn't end up looking at religion, but I think there may be, Wendy, I'm actually not sure if your study was not, okay. Other folks that are looking potentially at religion as well. Although I think within the Black community, religion if you're doing a study on how Black Americans classify other potentially Black targets, I think there's fewer religions that might be under consideration than a broader classification project like Ariella Schatzter's project that did use religion, but with a range of skin colors and ancestry results.
It's great. Yeah, so great talk. This is a really great paper. I wondered if, and this is sort of getting you to think outside of the data and sort of where the project is heading next or other questions that it leaves you thinking about, but I was thinking about sort of classifiers like social distance to the setting. So the 2 settings that you have are the census and the scholarship and sort of this question of stakes, but I wondered if you thought about like in respondents' own personal lives and in their social lives, these claims around race, like in social settings, or, I'm thinking about the way you opened the talk around sort of your experience with Black graduates at Penn, like that claim in that sort of social setting.
Yeah.
But anyways, wondering if you started to think about like expanding your idea of setting, not to just sort of like administrative claims, but.
Yeah, but more social claims, like if I think that's a really great question as well. We didn't end up doing that obviously for this study, but I think there's so many moments where a racial sort of classification and identification moment could happen that likely really differs. Well, at least I would think they really differ. Maybe I should think though, given that it didn't, the 2 setting conditions didn't change how people were classifying others, maybe they're going to be similar across other differently staked types of moments. But something that we've been thinking about, we haven't thought about the next experiment so much yet. We've been like, now that we have all this data, let's analyze it and go into some of those qualitative documents, but certainly when the time comes to run another experiment, which, any day now, that could be something that we think about. Yeah, I think it's a really good suggestion. Yes.
I'm interested in how for your respondents, I guess they were all people obviously self-identified, self-classified as Black. And so 54, they identified as having about 54% sub-Saharan.
Yes, they thought that they had about either 53 or 54% sub-Saharan African ancestry.
So I was just interested that your low and high treatment conditions were both below that 54% level.
Yes.
So can you say a little bit more about how you chose those 2?
Sure. No, that's a great question.
To portion?
Yeah, so we didn't want it to be too. We figured if it was too high, that it would just like 100% of the time that person would be classified as Black. And so we wanted to look specifically around, I guess, the margins of people who may or may not be classified as Black in many different settings. And so we wanted to focus on, you know, like very little and then a little more than that, but not trying to get into people who are going to be, you know, all the time classified as Black. But I do think it's an interesting question where the thresholds are and how, you know, how high up you could go in sub-Saharan African ancestry and still not be classified as Black under certain conditions, or what other features about a person might keep somebody with 70-some% sub-Saharan African ancestry from being classified as Black. Those are all really great questions. But the reason we picked such comparatively low levels is because we were thinking about like the lower sort of bounds and the margins. Interestingly though, people are actually, so the average self-identifying Black American in the US has something like 73% sub-Saharan African ancestry. So even in people's perceptions of the broader Black community, they're not quite accurate. And so it's interesting too to see that people think, you know, that most Black Americans that they may be interacting with have, and again, you know, race and ancestry are these different things that of course they're correlated in a sense that you can look at how much sub-Saharan African ancestry the average self-identifying Black American has. But the fact that people are also sort of underestimating that, I think is interesting. And I was surprised by that too. I thought that people would either say 50% or 100%. And I thought 100% would be actually a more likely response because for US born Americans who self-identify as white, on average, they have nearly 100% European ancestry. The same is true for Asian populations in the US. And so I thought that people maybe would have a misunderstanding of, or just an incorrect guess on that, but people actually tended to underestimate as opposed to overestimating.
The 54% estimate of sub-Saharan African, that's an average, right?
That's the average of
Across your response.
across the respondents. Well, it's either 53 or 54%.
Well,
And then the other one is, yes, but
but I can't remember if you did this, but I was just thinking you could look at sort of quartiles, right? So those who have like, there are probably some who estimate having a quite low
yes,
ancestry percentage and some.
yes. And we did have, looking for the, I may not be able to find it. It's this one, here's the table, but then there's a, yes. So we did have that there are these, oh, it's very light up here. Oh, this one's better. We did have these spikes at like 50%. And, you know, over in this region, this is perception of their own ancestry and then perceptions of the average Black American, again, this big spike at 50%. So a range of beliefs, but also interestingly, some people who think that they have nearly none. So I'm not totally sure what to make of those respondents. And these are primarily respondents who have not taken genetic ancestry tests before.
That's interesting though.
Yeah.
They think it's zero.
Yes, no, it's fascinating. Fascinating. Both of these distributions we have like spent a long time looking at.
So this is the distribution, but you could look to see whether there's a difference.
Yes, exactly. So sorry, to get back to Wendy's point, you could also, we didn't do this, but I could, you know, do it today, even splitting up into the different sort of bins and seeing if there's differences within bins rather than using it as a continuous underlying interaction. Yeah, that's a great session. Thank you.
I have just a brief question. I mean,
Yes.
the US population is becoming more mixed.
Yes.
And, are there any lessons here about mixture and classifications? We're still using, labels and constructions that come from the one drop rule. I mean, are there any lessons here about looking at classifications differently or something?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think, you know, we see this sense of like an inclusive hypodescent here, but the population is, as you mentioned, increasingly getting more mixed and more multiracial. And so I think in particular, looking at different racial groups is going to continue to be more interesting in how for the sort of biracial, multiracial population who may or may not identify as Black, but still have a large amount of sub-Saharan African ancestry who may be classified as Black by others or may not be, may have a Black identifying parent or not. I think there's just going to continue to be more questions there. And so at least we're seeing here that people when given a single classification outcome, they were classified Ava as Black, but we didn't, again, because of sample size, although I do think that would be an interesting question, is also asking if they could, okay, pick one race for Ava first and then pick multiple. And I would imagine that people are also likely to classify her as biracial or multiracial as well. So more to do, and I think, certainly not only with this kind of study, but given the changing underlying demography of the country is gonna be more relevant.
It's approaching 1 o'clock, so thank you.
Thank you.